Good evening and welcome, everybody. It is Tuesday, February 11th, 2020 at 6:30 p.m. I'm calling this meeting of the Wausau Common Council to order, seeing as how we have a quorum. We'll start tonight's proceedings with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Take a roll call. Take a roll call vote.
Okay, so.
Turn on your mic.
Okay, I'm pitch hitting here, so please bear with me.
We'll get through it tonight, folks, don't worry.
If you will all please begin voting so that we can take attendance. Maybe I was supposed to do this.
10 members?
Yep.
We have 10 members present. And there's nobody registered to come forward and speak tonight, so right off the bat, we're going to have a presentation tonight for the South Riverfront Master Plan and the Towers Master Plan. And this is being put on by neighborhood planners and Andrew and Garrett. They've been working with the city for some time on this. And gentlemen, if you could, come forward. You're up. Make your presentation.
All right,
State the name and address for the record, please.
Absolutely. Andrew Dane, 516 East Pacific Street, Appleton, Wisconsin.
That was the street I grew up on.
Really?
Yes.
It's not the same house, is it?
No, I grew up on 1211.
Oh, nice. Okay. So,
Small
excellent.
world.
Small world. Well, we are happy to be back here today. Myself, with neighborhood planners, Garrett, with Perry, with Design Studio, et cetera, part of the team that worked on 2 projects for the city this past year. They kicked off South Riverfront Master Plan, was really looking at about 30 acres down by the Wausau Whitewater, the farmers market area, the county buildings, kind of everything from kind of Washington Street, River Drive, down to Island Place apartments, if I'm remembering the names correctly. And then the second study was the Towers area study, kind of focused around the McClellan block and that greater area. So we started this thing off in May last year, really got started in June. We were up here for some meetings, some stakeholder meetings, and attended some public events. And then we took a little bit of a break over the summer, back full throttle this fall, mostly wrap things up by early December. We were here, I think, December 1st or 2nd week of December. We presented a plan commission and economic development committee. So some of you, I think, may be part of those groups and have already heard this. Some of you have not. And you can go ahead and do the next slide. There we go. Okay, so we're basically, so the South Riverfront is off on kind of Speaker right, and the Towers area was off on kind of Speaker's left. Oh, thanks. Was that the center button? Okay. And really, you know, this plan, the Towers, the South Riverfront Master Plan off here is really kind of a high-level master plan to look at future potential in this area. And the Towers area market study was really looking, this is kind of looking long-term at sort of the development of potentially of a new neighborhood, essentially, along the South Riverfront, which is, I think, essentially pretty exciting, leveraging some of the assets down there. And then the Towers area market study was in some ways kind of a scenario study to sort of get you guys ahead of the curve a little bit and to be a little bit more proactive when the McClellan ramp comes down in a few years, 2 to 3 to 4 years. Was really the emphasis on the Towers area study is really coming up with some scenarios. How do we plan for the future of this area once that McClellan ramp comes down? But both of these projects, I think, have the potential to create 2 new neighborhoods really along the riverfront and kind of nestling both sides of downtown. And I think together with kind of future planning around the former mall site, you know, you've got some exciting opportunities here to get more people into your downtown. Next slide.
Would it be helpful if we brought the lights down near that screen? Is that too bright for our audience?
Yeah.
The right behind you, that's switched by the door. Should be the front one.
So we're going to start with South Riverfront Master Plan. I'll tee this up, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the, so this is just an aerial view of the South Riverfront Master Plan. Garrett will talk about the river walk, the public market concept, the farmers market, some of the improvements, public amenity improvements and boulevard treatments. I'll start things off by talking a little bit about the housing opportunities. Kind of from north to south, we envision this parcel up here as potential hotel site. That was identified as a hotel in a few previous studies that had been done, and we thought with its location, proximity to the downtown, and with the activities that are going on, that could be an attractive hotel site. But we also know that Stantec, another consultant, did a hotel market study for you 3-4 years ago, and that basically came back and said you do not have demand for a hotel at this point in time. So you'll have to monitor that as things go ahead, and if there is not a market for that site as a hotel, it would also be a great, we think, apartment or condo residential opportunity. Where's Brad? Where's Brad? Oh, okay, you can do the click. Okay, thank you. So South Riverfront Master Plan, go ahead and next slide. Thanks. So slide on the right here is from 1950. It's kind of showing some older industrial uses. And what kind of jumped out at me when I looked at this slide is looking at sort of the railroad cut through here, and it struck me that this area was kind of divorced or separated from the city. There really didn't appear to be a strong connection into the downtown, and that's somewhat the case today with this goofy intersection over here with River Drive and Washington Street and First Street. There's a little bit of a disconnect. Next slide. So this is just kind of our process. I'm not going to really go through this in any depth, but we did some stakeholder meetings. We were at the farmers market. We got about 300 people stop by our booth that day to give us input on concepts. We did a little open house at Whitewater Music Hall and a few more stakeholder meetings and the Plan Commission presentation, as I mentioned, in December. Next slide. Just some photos of sort of existing conditions. Part of the study, we did a very high-level sort of environmental review of the sites. You do have the county-owned buildings are in a closed site, but the WPS site has some contamination, but it's nothing that we haven't seen in other cities and addressed successfully through environmental remediation, vapor barriers, other technologies. It's nothing that would preclude you from developing on a portion of the site. And then obviously you've got some floodplain, 100-year floodplain, floodway issues that will also limit some of the development opportunities down in that area. Next slide. We did a little market study as part of this, and we based on the numbers that we ran, believe there's a unmet need for 200 to 300 owner-occupied units within the downtown, and that we think could be accommodated in this area, and a similar figure in terms of rental units. Price points we had, we thought this being down in South Riverfront with a lot of amenities and high quality of life, it could be an opportunity to introduce some more market rate housing that's there's not a ton of in terms of that apartment. So we looked at 1,200 plus on monthly rent ranges. Doesn't mean you couldn't also introduce some affordable housing down there as well, and it might make sense to do the market rate stuff kind of towards the water and maybe do the affordable or workforce housing stuff back towards River Drive or the railroad tracks, just to maximize the development potential for the site. Next slide. These were some of the overarching goals we came up with the steering committee, was really establishing a thriving neighborhood, supporting a year-round market, providing year-round activities for different age groups, embracing that outdoor recreation theme that was identified in the Greater Wausau Area Strategic Economic Development Plan. It's basically just leveraging the assets that you have in this area. You've got the farmers market, you've got the water, you've got the Wausau Whitewater. So it's kind of just the rule of thumb in economic development is leveraging your assets, and it just usually works better than starting from scratch. So it's just building off of the great things that are already happening down there in a sense. Next slide. Some of the housing concepts, so this is kind of a long river drive. We're proposing this area, which is somewhat naturalized right now, but it's also accommodates is also gravel parking lot for the farmers market. We're proposing this as a new park. This would be River Edge Park that would essentially be kind of a, perhaps could be sort of a keystone or showcase for your River Edge trail system, and it could really be a strong amenity to sort of drive some development here. So this could be some row homes, townhomes, stacked flats. We really see the opportunity to introduce some different types of housing products into this area, given the size. Next slide. And then this is looking a little bit closer towards the farmers market, so a little bit further north. So that last slide may have been, maybe that's more attainable workforce housing. This is maybe more market rate or maybe some luxury housing units, fronting the water. But also maybe perhaps incorporating some green elements and maintaining some semblance of kind of that outdoor theme, so that it feels maybe a little, still feels urban, but also sort of recreational and outdoorsy. Next slide. The overall, so this is the overall plan perspective. This is that, I think you called it the powerhouse or the dam building where they were trying to do a, like a co-working thing in here. And this is Whitewater Music Hall. This is where I mentioned we envisioned a potential hotel or apartment or condo building. And then Garrett's going to come on up and kind of walk us through the next set of slides to go over some of the public amenities. And I'd also just kind of cue Garrett up a little bit. Garrett's been very involved in city of Eau Claire over the last several years, decade perhaps, in helping revitalize their riverfront, waterfront, and so we're kind of relying on some of his expertise to help inform some of our designs here.
Thanks, Andrew. We can go to the next slide. So one of the highlights, or one of the bigger, when we were down there doing our intel and kind of talking to all the people that are within the community, one of your major players is the farmers market. A big trend and a big amenity is having that market down there and viable for more than just the farmers market use. It also brings crowds, so it's also gonna spill out into other retail. So when we first looked at it, we're like, why is this thing on this gravel lot? It's kind of shoved off to the side. So we talked to the farmers and said, do you guys think it would be okay if we tried to make this a little bit more of a highlight experience for the city? And all of them, for the most part, said yes, as long as they have accessibility and they have the ability to get their vehicles and their produce in and out. Another highlight also is this is what we're calling the mill building. Everybody hopefully is familiar. There's a deconstructed mill building that was used. That would be the highlight of the farmers market. So the idea is there was always this thought of trying to grab onto the upper level, bring them down through, and then make the connection over to cross to WPS. So there's not this block on the river. So centralizing the farmers market, the mill building now becomes like a four-season building. It can be cladded, it can be updated, it can be put together to where it's a four-season use. So your winter market comes down here, and then when it's not in use for the farmers market, it's a convention space. It is a family reunion. It's a space where it can be used for the community for many different events. And then also looking at how do we make that kind of a flexible building where the windows or the doors can open up, so it has a little bit more open air feel. And then in addition to that, having this grand central plaza for performances, for entrance, and just for generally being down at the river, greening up the center's piece with some seating areas and green, and then flanking off to the side with more of an open pavilion. We'll show you some of the perspectives that were happening. But then the main thing is that you have this kind of overlook, that you get the image of the river. You come down a stairway or an elevator, as Andrew had mentioned. Crossing over across River Drive, coming into the main plaza, and then eventually crossing through a bridge. That bridge was already speculated by Whitewater, the Whitewater Group. They have plans in place that they have already addressed with an engineer. So that's nothing really new or inventive. That was something that we responded from the Whitewater Group. Next slide. So here you can kind of see, so the main farmers would be housed in the mill building. And again, that's the exact rendition of what the mill building looks like. It'll be just updated and clad with newer materials. But it still gives that bones, that old historic thought, with the interior core being that beam, so that won't change. And then that same architecture that's in the mill building would be reflected out in these open structures. And again, bands, jugglers, ice sculptures. This should be a four-season area that really celebrates the river and the heritage of the river down here. The kayak area does not get touched. It's awesome. It's like, I've never been in a community where there's been that much grassroots initiative and financial put into that river, and not one dime has been spent by the city. That is, you guys have a great, great thing going, so that doesn't go away. Unfortunately, this year, they didn't have the ability, they were fixing things, so they didn't have it. But when we were down here last year, you could see that there was people really just jonesing to get down here and get on the river. So this starts to become even a bigger destination for a wider reach. Wausau, to me, to Andrew, is a gem in the rough. You've got the mountain, you've got the kayaking, you've got the river that is probably more scenic than most rivers that you see in some cities this size. So really, as Andrew said, leverage that amenity and bring people down. So having that central market, that creates a conduit or an area to bring people to the space, and then marrying it with the already active use of the kayak. The second part is you already have river life started up on the north side. And is there a way that we can make that connection from river life and have this mile-long riverfront that grabs onto that scenic river and creates, because right now it's just kind of a little 12-foot, maybe 8-foot wide path, but people are using it. They're like, we were out there in March. There was snow all over, but there was 15, 20 people running on this path. So if you give them a broader amenity, that they're going to be using it further. So the main breadth of the river walk would be somewhere between 15 and 20 feet in width. And then there's a small green space in between with benches along the back side, so spectation to the kayaks can be done. In addition, on the back side of this walk, spotted all the way along the entire river walk, will be these concrete pads where vendors for both kayaks, so let's say it's somebody that's selling kayak paddles or something like that. It's a space to have retail space when there's a kayak event happening, and also a flex space for when the farmers market's happening, or if there's an event, there could be a food truck. So it's just a space that has electric and water and whatnot that becomes a flex space for use. Next slide. A little bit more detail, you can kind of see we're getting into the mix, throwing in some rocks, throwing in those natural elements. Andrew talked about a theme. We believe because this is such an active society, this is an active community, try to create that design thought around more of an active lifestyles thought, okay? So people that are coming here to go kayak, give them things that they can do within this development that keeps them here and keeps them coming back. Next slide. Here's a little bit more detail so you can kind of see that bridge coming across. Kayak is actively engaged. There's already, I think right now, Whitewater has added some more seating in this area. But just having those nodes that go along the river to create those spaces. And then now you have more flex space with green along the back. Right now, all the buildings are right up against the riverfront, and it really kind of closes that kayak course in. This will open it up and allow for more flex and flow space. Next slide. And I think that's the South Riverfront.
Well,
What-
a little bit on the River Edge Park. I
Oh,
guess.
the park, yes. So again, this would be kind of the natural bookend of river life. So you got river life to the north, and then this would be to the south. It's already existing green space. The kayak people, when they come here, That's their main setup and staging area. So how do we improve that to make it more organized, so it's not so willy-nilly, so that we can have even more kayakers come in? Still being a unique aspect of having a tent in your downtown. There's very few cities in Wisconsin that I know of that allow camping in your downtown. So that's a very huge amenity, and that could be a kitschy kind of thing that draws people to this area, that lifestyle thought. But the nice thing is that this development that you see right here, that is a parking lot and a building that takes up where the existing gravel lot is. That gravel is there because it's a cap. That was a remediated site, a hot site, that was remediated by WPS. By putting a parking lot in a building, you've just changed that gravel to concrete, and you've still capped it. But we can flex with that side to make this a bigger green space, and then also having a southern connection from River Drive through the parking, through the development, and then down and having some kind of a terminal plaza at the Riverwalk. It could be like a trailhead to get to the Riverwalk system. It could be a dog park. Again, other things that we talked about. Whitewater was talking about having a beer garden. Maybe that's something, if the ordinance are changed, that's something that could be happening in the farmers market area. A lot of natural playgrounds, but not natural playgrounds just for kids, for adults as well. Make it so that it's engaging, like a climbing wall or something of that nature. And again, there's already picnic areas and trails, but how do we spruce those up a wee bit? And then additionally, there's one public bathroom down there right now. So expanding that, elevating the architecture of it to where it becomes one cohesive piece that is active when kayaks are happening. It doesn't butt up against the farmer's market. And in whole, also has the ability of infilling that residential need for the downtown. Next slide. Just some pictures of what possibilities could happen. Definitely winter characteristic or winter aspects. Maybe we could throw. I know you have the skating in the town center, but there's always a possibility of doing skating someplace else. You could do a skating ring, skating area within the park, but definitely having, or even like some kind of a trail that would have a cross country shoe or cross country ski trail that is unique to the downtown. Next slide. And then we're going to switch to Andrew.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
Just a few thoughts on the just phasing here. So we had three sort of phases. Phase one was working with the county, and I think you have some willing partners here from our conversations for land acquisition assembly. As that happens over the next few years, you might revisit the feasibility of a hotel to see if that makes sense. Get into some more design plans. You've got a preliminary design to improve that intersection of River Drive and Washington Street. Phase two would be looking at developing probably those public amenities first, the farmers market, possibly the hotel, park, residential development. Phase three, we thought maybe the final phase could be along River Drive or on the east side of River Drive, between River Drive and the railroad tracks. We currently have some industrial buildings in there. Okay, next slide. I'll whip through this one just a little bit faster. So towers area study. Next slide. We, again, looked at some current conditions, did a market assessment, put together essentially some redevelopment concepts, did a pretty deep dive into parking over here, and came up with some recommendations. Next slide. Again, we sort of defined the towers area. We looked at a little bit bigger area, but the core focus was sort of in and around the McClellan ramp. Next slide. It's a very similar planning process, kind of last summer till December, about a 6-month study period. Next slide. Current conditions. One of the concepts that we had in here was to introduce some what we were calling green fingers or green streets that would essentially link your existing neighborhoods to the east of downtown to the river. So sort of every other street we would really purposefully dress up with more trees and greenery to really promote walking and connections of your downtown urban neighborhoods, your existing historic neighborhoods, to the downtown. And some of these photos, 3rd Street has some trees. Some of these other streets, we thought just adding some trees would go a long way towards enhancing the streetscape. Next slide. Somewhat similar sort of analysis in terms of the market study. For this area, we thought that the monthly rent range could be a little bit lower. So we had 600 to 1,200. So there may be some smaller units here. There's maybe some housing targeted, maybe workforce housing, or maybe some housing targeted towards younger professionals, working in some of your tech or financial service, industries. We looked at projected about 80 to 100,000 square feet of office space demand based on Department of Workforce Development projections, and looking at the market here. So it's unlikely that somebody would build a spec office for that site, of that size. But if the right developer or opportunity comes along, we think that there could be demand for office space down there. And then a limited amount of commercial space. We put 5,000 square feet. We really like how you're concentrating your Main Street commercial district along 3rd, and we think that what we've proposed here essentially will help the vibrancy of the 3rd Street without detracting too much from it. So we don't see the need or the desire to introduce a lot more commercial space down there. What would be introduced would be as part of a mixed-use building, maybe a little bit of restaurant, coffee shop, a restaurant or two. But really, next slide, the idea is to support your existing retail and restaurants on 3rd Street. Overall plan goals here, again, supporting some new residential mixed-use development, trying to come up with some concepts that would support future planned office uses, trying to come up with a parking strategy that will support additional growth downtown, improving mobility and access to the river. Next slide. So some of the key ideas from this redevelopment framework, again, sort of envisioning River Drive as sort of this residential spine. So you've got, the Dudley Tower there, this is, kind of a landmark, and perhaps some additional office. But River Drive, sort of flanking River Drive behind the J.C. Penney's, where you've got the empty surface lot. Further north at that ABC Supply Building site, that could potentially, be some additional residential. We really think this area is really well suited for residential, given the for both office and residential, given the amenities. Residential standpoint, you've got the outdoors, but also now with the YMCA, Aspirus, restaurants, retail, and the office, as well. You've got YMCA, you've got restaurants, you've got things that are attractive. The green streets you can kind of barely see there, but sort of every other street is green, as I mentioned before. And we're looking at trying to, some options for maybe distributing new parking demand in the future versus concentrating it in a larger block size ramp. We've seen this trend really all over Wisconsin, with a lot of underutilized large block size ramps that have been built over the last few decades tend to be underutilized. People in Wisconsin don't like to drive up to the fourth, fifth, sixth floor of parking ramps. We just don't. So we think there's an opportunity to maybe get a little bit more creative in terms of addressing future parking needs. Next slide. And so this, again, was sort of the core study area, the Central Towers area. I'm sure everybody's kind of familiar with this site. I guess, of course, the block north of McClellan, that former school's been removed, and so that's just that building's been cleared. Next slide. This was kind of a plan view of that same perspective. With in here, we did sort of a couple of things we were sort of tasked with here. Was helping to somehow come up with some ideas for this skyway that was promised to the Dudley Tower folks a long time ago. One concept, we came up with a concept of if there is another office building that built, to the north of the existing Dudley Tower, that perhaps there's a opportunity there to put that skywalk in to add some value, especially if that second tower incorporated some public parking. And again, one of our strategies with the parking was perhaps rather than the city building a standalone public parking deck, that there might be some sort of public-private partnership whereby the city could help incentivize the incorporation of some public parking into a private development. So we've seen this trend in some other communities we've worked in, and talk a little bit about it in the study itself. But that essentially helps the developer incentivize their project a little bit. It also minimizes some of the long-term risk of developing a standalone parking structure from the city's perspective. The area here, so the Diocese Park, the Diocese is currently the plan right now, and you do have a plan for a green park that takes up about a third to a half of this block, but it's oriented north-south. We were proposing that that park be flipped 90 degrees to orient this way. So it helps create this sort of green spine and green street that connects down to the river, and becomes an amenity for some new housing or mixed-use development that might occur on this block north of McClellan. Here on the McClellan block, we're showing, a future mixed-use building. Again, it could incorporate a little bit of commercial, maybe down on the corner here as an amenity for the office, but also it could incorporate some retail. Some parking into the structure, into a mixed-use structure, and part of this could not only serve the office building here to the east, but if it were situated, perhaps we could even have some easily accessible first floor parking tucked within the building that could be used for folks visiting 3rd Street, for example. We showed some bump outs here, potential of maybe making a connection across to the existing Dudley Tower here, doing some traffic calming, and then there you could have potentially an elevated plaza here of some sort, or some green space, a green roof on the 2nd or 3rd story of this building. Next slide. This is a perspective looking down McClellan towards the river with that green space off on the right as kind of an amenity to a new apartment building built on that site. Next slide. This is that perspective kind of looking back up McClellan. One of the concepts we came up with was having this really strong pedestrian plaza that really becomes this sort of major gateway down to the river. River life is a little bit on the periphery of the downtown. The South Riverfront is also kind of on the periphery of the downtown. This is right in the core of your downtown, and as 3rd Street continues to revitalize and strengthen, we think that this could be a pretty compelling feature to sort of bring people from that 3rd Street corridor in the downtown down to the river. And perhaps be a nice amenity or selling point for a future office development.
And in addition, that the bridge was not just intended for a connection between the two buildings. It was also intended to be a gateway to the riverfront. So as you're up on the square, as you're 2 blocks down, this is an elevated piece, and there were some other renderings. When you go through the master plan, you'll see some of the renderings, the earlier renderings. And that could be a branding for Dudley. It could be whatever. It could be the Dudley Riverfront. It could be a number of different things that could be written on it. But what it does is it gets an elevated thought to bring people and draw people down to the river. It opens that river up a little bit more so that it really starts to become like this is the gateway. And you can go north or south either way if you want to go down to South Riverfront, or if you want to go up to River Place
River Life.
River Life, thank you, and keep continuing on. This starts to become that venue, the main attraction to get you to the river.
All right, a couple more slides, and we'll wrap this one up. Next slide here. These are just, okay, a little bit on the parking. I might just hold off on this for the Q&A piece, but, we did inventory the parking in this area, about 500 stalls currently available. The McClellan garage and adjacent parking lot contain about 418. Next slide. if no other development were to occur down here, we came up with a bunch of scenarios. But in a nutshell, if there were no other development that were going to occur downtown, it's possible you could take that McClellan ramp down, and while Mark wouldn't be too happy about it, you could maybe take it down and you could absorb that parking need in your underutilized parking ramps and on-street, et cetera. However, if there's really any of the scenarios we looked at, if there's any other additional development down there, you're going to need new parking spaces, and that's what's kind of under this column. So we came up with a bunch of scenarios that say, okay, what if we had introduced a little more office space or retail or residential? What's that estimated parking demand going to be? How much is available? What is the impact? So the thought is here, over the next couple years, we know there's already some folks that are coming forward expressing some interest in doing some development down here. But as over the next couple years, as plans start to emerge or projects start to surface, you can go back to this table and go back and kind of make a final decision with regard to the McClellan ramp. And as we've suggested in this study, we think you could incorporate or meet a lot of the parking demand in some mixed-use parking structures. Next slide. That's kind of what I just said. This is an example that one of our teammates worked on down in, I think, was this Wausau, I believe, mixed-use building, but it's a parking ramp. This is the public-private partnership. This is a private development. The city stuck some money into this in exchange. They got some public parking that's on the first floor, tucked back inside this building, but they also got some residential above, and then I think there's a coffee shop on one of these corners. Next slide. These were some of the overall recommendations that I think I just already went over with you. Next slide. And that's gets us through just over 30 minutes. Hopefully not too long.
Very interesting, and thank you for all the work that you've done here in the past year. I know we've all been collaborating together, but it's a good presentation and another plan that's being done for the city of Wausau. Do any of the council members have any questions for either Andrew or Garrett? Mrs. Rasmussen.
Thank you. Not necessarily a question, but I guess more of a comment. And, I had seen this presentation also in economic development. And I think that going forward with, any facets of this plan, we all know that we can create a plan. We also know that there's little likelihood that 100% of that plan will ever come to fruition, but it is a good starting off point to get ideas. That said, one of the key components of all of this is going to be stakeholder engagement and stakeholder re-engagement. And one thing we cannot do is dismiss the concerns of our existing stakeholders. We already have stakeholders in the downtown area that have invested over $40 million in our downtown to make it viable. That's why it's successful. And I think that at some point, if we want to talk about what the future of the McClellan ramp is, and there is a plan that calls for the elimination of over 400 parking stalls that currently have a commercial use today, that we need to then make sure that we have all those stakeholders on board and that discussion includes all of them. Because if the building connected today to the McClellan ramp secures a tenant that brings along 150 employees, 80% of those people come with a car. And I think we need to be realistic about, we all want to be less car dependent. We all want to engage in alternative modes of transportation more often than we do. But today, and 5 years from now, and maybe 10 years from now in central Wisconsin, our dependency on the automobile is not going away overnight. And I think that if we want to engage employers to come downtown and own a business here and employ workforce down here, we have to meet those parking needs where people cannot be expected to park and walk 8 blocks to get to work in the morning, because that is a non-starter with our downtown workforce that we have today. And so we have to be very cautious as we go forward with what the future of the McClellan ramp and any replacement for the McClellan ramp looks like, and make sure that we have all those stakeholders with us as we make those decisions. Because, you can't ask those stakeholders to spend the last 20 years making investments in Wausau's downtown, where planning was done and promises were made, and then suddenly pull the rug out and say, we're going to take a totally different tack and a different direction. And planning evolves and communities evolve, and I think forward thinking, we do need to plan for the future, but I think we also need to make sure that we have all of those stakeholders at the table and that those voices get heard as well. And so that's just what I would advocate for, is You know, we know that within the next 5 years, something is likely going to happen with the McClellan ramp. But before it does, we need to make sure that we have some substantive discussions with those key stakeholders.
The good news is, not just with myself, but this entire body over the last few years, we've always wanted to hear from the stakeholders involved and residents involved in just about everything in the planning stage, and we will continue to do so. Everybody communicating and working together, which is what we have been doing for the last couple of years, is why we've been successful and will continue to be. Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just very briefly, it's kind of a misnomer maybe to look at this and call it, the master plan, because it's a vision plan.
Yeah.
It's, where we start with other things we are doing and have done in the city. We start with, what might happen, what might it look like? And that really helps us to, move forward to try to achieve elements of that, But we also have to do, as Alder Rasmussen says, do that, within the bounds of our present realities and needs. So and that's served us well in the past, and that will certainly come into play as we go forward. So I just didn't want, the public looking at this and going, oh, this is what it's going to be.
Yeah, that's a good point. I will even say, just to clarify, the South Riverfront was technically South Riverfront Master Plan. The Towers area was technically, I think they call it Towers Area Market Study. And I think, it's good points from both sides here. There are elements in here. This is always good to remind people, because especially if you're not in city government or if you're not in this profession, and people put these things forward and say, well, when is that going to get built up in the left-hand corner? So I think you're absolutely right. These are ideas, and, there may be 2, 3, 4 things that come out of this, or, certain elements. The Towers area, is certainly, a challenging area. When you have a lot of users downtown already, and you're talking about tampering with parking, it's very, the only thing that's perhaps more contentious in parking is sometimes when you talk about signage. And so, I think that one of the recommendations, and one of the top recommendations, might have been the first recommendation in the end of the Towers Area Market Study, was to take this study out and have more one-on-one conversations with the property owners and the business owners. We tried to engage some of these folks through this process, but, you don't always get everybody around the table at the right time, and, there can be challenging conversations to be had. So I think that one, is proceeding forward and continue to have those dialogues. The South Riverfront Master Plan, in some senses seemed to me a little bit more viable as in terms of, a vision, or a more concrete vision, and that, you've got a little bit more of a blank slate there, as, the county seemed to be willing participants and potentially turning over some of that land, and you potentially have, you still have one of the businesses down there, Opportunity Inc., they would need to find a new home, right? So there's hurdles to overcome there, but eventually, yeah, eventually.
Not right away.
Mrs. Towle.
Thank you so much for the ideas and the vision for the South Riverfront and the two towers or second towers, I don't know what we were calling it, but I just have some comments about the South Riverfront. I didn't really hear about mixed-use opportunities for development. I hear more of how we elevate the farmers market, how we would have some more housing opportunities or more affordable housing opportunities. Were there any discussions in your findings and in the master planning of any retail opportunities down there?
Yeah, we did, yeah, that's a good observation. So the market, the old mill building, which, could be a public market, could be year-round market, could be an incubator for small businesses. Who knows what that will actually ultimately look like. But part of our thought was you would have some retail that might incorporate some retail in that mill building. So that was the, this building right here, what we call the mill building, or the public market fronting the farmers market. So that could be the opportunity to incorporate some retail down there.
Okay.
And then, yeah, we didn't, this building right on the corner, I think could potentially have a mixed-use component. I would be a little nervous about thinking mixed use over here, just because the distance to the downtown, we've seen in a lot of communities have come out and tried to do a lot of mixed use, especially in the last decade. A lot of them haven't been successful. Some of them have. A lot of times, even down in Madison, you see a lot of these mixed use buildings, and if they're not in the right location, that ground floor retail sits empty. So we were trying to be, I guess maybe a little bit on the conservative side. These could be mixed use. I think if any of this was going to be mixed use, I think it would want to be this building, given the proximity to the downtown. My other thought here, and kind of thinking about this, is, if we introduce some more residential here, that'll also make the Whitewater Music Hall more viable and provides, support for that.
And then you mentioned about access and being a little distant from the downtown, which was a great segue to my next question about mobility.
Yeah.
You talked about mobility in the last plan about the towers. Were there any conversations about improving mobility on River?
Yeah.
Because there's really two entrances in on the road, and then I guess you can say 2.5, because if you take that
Yeah.
back, I can't count that as
Right.
another opportunity, but I guess it could be. Were there conversations about improving that? Because I know maybe 6 months ago, there was another planning study done
Yep.
about improving
Yes.
the one-ways around downtown, the
Yep.
8 city blocks.
Yeah,
and-
we reviewed like 25 plans as we were putting this together. And one of them was that recently completed tool study, urban design and transportation plan that basically looked at this whole area around the mall, and it also looks, so in our plan, we sort of carried forward one of the concepts for constructing the intersection of River Drive and Washington Street. So the idea here is that River Drive comes down here currently, and it angles up to First Drive here by Whitewater Music Hall. The concept that the previous consultants came up with was to bend it back so it tees into Washington Street here, just over the Slough Bridge, and forms more of a natural intersection. And then this little leg goes away, and that actually creates a much stronger pedestrian connection into your downtown. The other piece I would add, and this was, I'll give credit to Garrett on this a little bit, River Drive, I'll let him just kind of quickly touch on kind of some thoughts we had on River Drive and how that might incorporate some pedestrian bike accommodation.
And Alder Neal, you hit it right in the nail on the head. This is a master planning document. This is a view from 30,000 feet. This intersection really, really needs to be evaluated in greater detail. There is a way of getting the engineers and the landscape architects and the architects together to make sure that it flows better. I just don't think it's really been successful. There's a lot of elevation change that make it difficult. It looks like the sweet spot for a roundabout, but because of the elevation change, it's too difficult. So Tool's solution of actually pulling River Drive down to the south and then teeing it in directly across from the parking lot entrance of the library was the best solution. But River Drive right now is kind of a Plano Jano street. If this kind of development goes in, we need to elevate that landscape. So putting in a boulevard, putting in streetscape, putting in bike lanes, like we talked about doing more, that kind of circulation. That's the kind of circulation. And when we were out and about listening to people, we heard a lot of people saying, God, we would love to live here and be able to ride our bikes to downtown. And we're not talking 30 and 40-year-olds. We are talking 60 and 70 and 75-year-olds who want to retire and live downtown. It's a big market that is underutilized, and it's a place that we think could really work here. So the bike aspect is another thing, making that trail a lot more fluent, and that's where we need to get into that detail to see how do we make it, because there's so much car traffic that goes through there. So that's that next level of design that has to get into that, so.
I think and then the other thing I'll just mention is when Garrett was working on the terms of mobility, so we have also introduced, we've punched through trails, pedestrian connections from the river up to River Drive, right here, right here, right here, right here. So we've added sort of 4 more purposeful connections.
And it kind of mimics that green finger thought as we did also on the design here, 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 here. So what we're trying to do is make those penetrations, those green penetrations, to bring pedestrians, to bring walkers, to bring bikers down to the river, because that's your amenity. That's your biggest asset that's really going to drive development. That's what drove Eau Claire's development. That's what drives La Crosse's development. It's that amenity that really makes this community strong. And then also opening up some more views to Rib Mountain, to get that view in the corridor. There's some great views of it right here. So it's a very unique setting for potentially awesome development.
Mr. Martins?
All right, thank you for presenting the plans this evening. And a couple of my comments and questions are sort of, you've answered, with the previous questions that you've addressed. And, for the most part, I really like the Riverfront Master Plan. I like how it's things are sort of opened up and soft. So these are more addressed towards the Towers Plan. And I know, now today, if you were to walk around the 100, 200, 300 blocks, north of Scott Street, it's pretty stark down there right now with the taller, the vertical buildings. So I like how this plan kind of opens things up and makes it more greener and softer. One of my concerns, though, is again based on mobility, and there's a bit of elevation change between the 100 block and the 400 block. And do you feel that's going to inhibit pedestrians at all, bringing pedestrians, say, down, from the 3rd Street down to 1st Street? Or do you think that's not so much of an issue, or because there's really two different purposes here, or?
Yeah, I guess, from my standpoint, it's gradual enough that I guess I don't see it being an impediment or a real barrier. I was kind of thinking about it from 3rd Street, even from up there, if you opened it up, you can almost see down to the river with that grade change. You're right, it is fairly, more than you might think. But, yeah, I don't, even from a bicycle standpoint, although I don't think we had bicycle lanes on those streets. We do have a bicycle lane. I didn't really highlight in this presentation. We were following some of the recommendations from some recent bike planning efforts that you've done here. Our plan does show bike lanes on River Drive through here, according to the plan. But I don't think we had on McClellan.
Yeah.
I don't think that was one that had the bike lane on it.
But McClellan would be a good spot for a lane, because it does, it parallels Scott Street, and a lot of people who may not want to be on Scott Street with a bicycle
Yeah.
would be a perfect opportunity.
Yeah.
So, maybe that green corridor fits.
Could fit that. And we were thinking also, with that green corridor, you could also do like expanded sidewalks. And I see a lot of communities that go to, 8, 10-foot wide, and it can accommodate bikes and peds in a pretty safe. One thing I didn't mention that I'll mention since we're talking about mobility that we got in the plan, I didn't show a slide on it, but we did show some pedestrian connections down here with the Aspirus Clinic going in. You've vacated a couple more streets here, so you've kind of created a big, somewhat of a super block down here. And we thought what we did is we showed up some pedestrian connections through that super block to help, break it up. Even though vehicles couldn't get through there, we would show some dedicated sidewalks and trails.
Okay. And then one last comment is, I know, you speak to, in the Towers area, to kind of limit the amount of mixed use, because we really don't want to pull people away from our downtown corridor, where the shopping is focused. In talking with one downtown business in particular, they mentioned that one amenity that would be desirable in the Towers area would be some type of a grocery or bodega or something like that, because if we're going to attract people with condos and apartments in this area, we're creating a food desert. And if you want to be able to walk or bike to get a bite to eat or pick up something, it's not available. easily, of course, other than taking your car. So that would be, one type of mixed-use type of amenity I think we really would need to focus on in any future planning in that area.
Would that be, you're talking beyond, because you do have that, is that you do have a natural food store down there?
Natural food,
You're
natural
talking about
food store is one thing,
You're
it's
talking about
something a little bit more,
bit
not,
more accessible.
I'm not talking about another, say a Pick and Save downtown, but, one of those smaller 10,000 square
Smaller.
foot groceries
Gotcha.
that
Okay,
are common in some of the larger municipalities.
yeah, it's a good comment.
Any other comments or questions from any of the council members? Thank you, gentlemen, so much. I know we'll be in contact in the future. This is just a start. Thank you
Great.
for the presentation.
Okay, thanks for your
Thank you.
time, appreciate it.
All right, folks, moving on to the consent agenda, starting with file number 20-0101 from the City Council. Sorry. Okay. Now we'll move on to the consent agenda, starting with file number 20-0101 from the City Council, minutes of the previous meeting dated January 28th of this year, and ending with file number 20-0101 from Public Health and Safety, a resolution approving or denying the various licenses as indicated. I'll entertain a motion to accept. Motion by Mr. Peckham, second by Mr. Neal.
You can begin voting. Awesome. That passes 10-0.
Leslie, take note. Okay.
This is how not to do it.
We're doing fine. We're doing fine. Moving on to the resolutions and ordinances, file number 20-0203 for the mayor's appointments. There is none this week. Stay tuned. Moving on to file number 20-0114 from CISM, the Capital Improvements and Street Maintenance Committee. Resolution approving developer's agreement with T-Bird Enterprises LLP and Back 40 Properties LLC for stormwater management facilities. Committee action approved 5-0. The fiscal impact will be a payment of $16,594. I'll entertain a motion to accept. Motion by Mrs. Rasmussen, second by Mr. Gisselman.
You can begin voting. And that passes 10-0.
Moving up to suspending the rules. 1D, transmission of committee business to council for the items marked pending committee action. A 2/3 vote will be required. Entertain a motion to accept. Motion by Mr. Nutting. Do I have a second? By Ms. Herbst.
Begin voting. And that passes 10-0.
File number 20-0205 from the finance meeting from earlier this evening. A resolution providing for the sale of approximately $5,120,000 in water system and sewer system revenue bond anticipation notes, Series 2020A. Final impact, the committee approved 4-0, and the fiscal impact is unknown at this time, dependent on the length of the bond issue and the interest rates. Thank you. I'll entertain a motion to accept. Motion by Mr. Nutting, second by Mr. Neal. Mrs. Towle.
Can you just come forward? Thank you. Can you share a little bit of the background on the $5 million that was dispersed originally in 2018, just to give
Sure.
some background to those who are in the audience or watching live if
Sure.
they're not familiar? They might confuse this with like the 70 million that we approved back in December.
Sure. So these were bond anticipation notes for water and sewer revenue bonds that were issued in 2018. Really, this is the extension of those bond anticipation notes until permanent financing can be secured through the Clean Water Fund Loan Program on the sewer side and the Safe Drinking Water Fund Loan program on the water side. So it's really an extension of the timing of the interim financing until permanent financing can be secured. So it's not the issuance of new money, it's really just refinancing the bond anticipation notes that were issued in 2018 and extending those for 2 years. One important feature as well is there will be a call feature on the bond anticipation notes. You'd have the ability to refinance them within 6 months. So assuming long-term financing can be secured imminently, you'd have the ability to refinance those and move them into the permanent financing.
Okay. And then I have another question, just to tie the numbers for me so I understand. If I'm looking at the account balance as of 1/31/2020, there's roughly about $1.4 million there. And then I looked at the schedule, right? And there is a April 2020 redemption date for full redemption of the bonds being refunded. Is that referring to the 1.4 million?
Nope, that's the full amount. So on April 1st, the full $5,055,000 is due, is payable. So you have unspent proceeds. It's anticipated that as part of the refinancing, you're going to spend those proceeds down.
So can you help explain what happens to the $1.4 million balance? I know we already issued, that's already issued to us. What happens to that remaining 1.4? I just,
You'd still have the ability to spend that.
so,
It's my understanding we have some bills from Donahue and Becker Hoppy of about 1.1 million, I think Eric said today. So those have yet to be paid out of that 1.4. And there probably will be future engineering bills that would absorb the rest of that balance. And one other thing I want to point out, the 5.1,200,000 or 5,120,000. That would be the maximum amount that we would borrow. Again, looking at the debt issuance costs, they would adjust that balance down once they get all of those final numbers in, because there's a number of debt issuance costs that they had to estimate. And so
Right.
at the final, it'll probably be less than that.
Right.
okay, thanks,
Yep.
Mary Ann, because you answered my next question about the variance
The
between,
difference.
between the two numbers. I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mrs. Rasmussen?
Thank you. Just a note from the Finance Committee that met prior to this meeting and considered this item this evening. We also learned that it's likely that the state-administered loans that we had applied for to refinance this item are expected to be ready to close by late summer. And so we certainly will likely not need the full 2 years, but you put it out there so that you wouldn't need to go through this process again if there was a short delay. But with those two plans, one being administered by the DNR, the other one administered by the Wisconsin Department of Administration, that allows us some extra time to get that paperwork in line and hopefully close those out by the end of summer or the early part of the fall.
And before you leave, your name and who you work for the record, please.
Sure. My name is John Cameron. I'm a senior municipal advisor with Ehlers and Associates.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, do we have a motion?
Yes, we do. Nadine, second by Neil. So you can begin voting. And that passes 10-0.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, so much. And at this time, there's nothing else on the agenda. However, we always like to have public comment or suggestions. Would anybody like to come forward and speak about an item on tonight's agenda or anything in particular? Now's your chance. Name and address, please. A
Judith
few
Miller,
minutes.
903 Kickbush Street. Good evening. I have to raise a point of order. I noticed in the minutes that the mayor's proclamation from the last council meeting was not quoted in full. Per Robert's Rules of Order, you have to. So I would suggest that you amend the minutes, please. Thank you.
All right, then.
Motion to adjourn?
Yes, well, not yet, no. She wants as far as an amendment and not, I was supposed to say, this is just public comment. If need be, we will bring it back. Okay. Would anybody else like to come forward and speak on an issue? And one last time, would anybody like to come forward and speak on another matter? We will look into that for you, Judith, okay? Thank you. No problem. Mr. Peckham?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to provide an update. About 6 or 8 weeks ago, this body passed a resolution asking our state elected officials to kind of get going on some state homelessness legislation. And I would like to think that it was partially because of our push. The state senate did take that up. They passed one part of it, which was $1 million state shelter subsidy program. Passed that 33-0. Everybody loved it, and the governor has signed it. And so I'm sure that funding is going to be available to shelters that want to apply for it in the near future. They did choose to use a different funding source than had been provided for, but it got it done, so that much is good, and hopefully some of the other programs will be considered in the future.
Thank you for the update. Does anybody else have anything else? Mary Ann?
Just a reminder, next Tuesday is Election Day, so remember to get out and vote. And also, if you get a chance, stop by the customer service counter and express your appreciation. The staff has really stepped up to help out with the election. Of course, we're missing our city clerk. They have done just an outstanding job. We're even making some changes to some processes to improve our efficiencies. So they really have been working very hard to make sure that this next event goes well. So thank you to them, and please remember to vote. And if you have any interest in being a poll worker, the need for poll workers is serious, and I can't begin to express how rewarding the work is. And I think if people gave it a try, it would be a one-day or a partial day commitment. And if you didn't like it, you would never have to do it again. But I really encourage people to give it a try, because you'll be surprised at how enjoyable it is. You're doing something for the community, for the country. You get to meet your neighbors and friends at the polling site and work with other nice-minded people. You really would be surprised at how much fun it is and how good you feel about doing it. So I would please ask anyone to stop by our HR department or the customer service counter and get an application for being a poll worker.
Thank you. With that, I'll take a motion to adjourn. Oh, you guys do this to me every time. Ms. Herbst, do I have a second? Mr. Nutting?
Okay.
Thank you for coming forward, so.
Begin voting. I feel like Vanna White.
Well, Vanna, send me a letter.
All right, and that passes. Surprise, surprise.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.